We've just come out of our first joint CIGI INET conference here in Canada. The CIGI INET partnership, which we entered into a little over a year ago, is a new partnership which brings together, I think, two very exciting organizations. INET, which is rethinking economics, and of course CIGI, which is rethinking governance, and how we can tackle common problems together. And we bring complementary skills, perspectives, people to these issues. This conference happened to focus on sovereign debt restructuring issues, which have come to the forefront again in today's economy because of what's been happening in Europe and in Greece in particular. But this is a reoccurring problem which we seem to go through every decade. And so there was a real sense that we could bring people together to bring some fresh perspectives and hopefully find a better way to address some of these questions, which inevitably will arise again in the future.
I think this conference on sovereign debt is very, very important. Recognizing how sovereign debt has been, what you might call, subsidized by all the system architecture, the so-called Bank for International Settlements, BIS Basel standards 1, 2, and 3, have encouraged financial institutions to load up on sovereign debt. They pay a very low capital charge, if any at all. As a result, what is a sovereign crisis with the so-called riskless asset has now been unmasked as a very risky proposition and propagated and become a banking crisis. So you have a banking crisis at the same time as you have a fiscal crisis, particularly in Europe right now. And how we unravel those things, how we address those things, how you divide the burden, who bears the burden of the adjustment, of the restructuring, is very important. Some people advocate inflation to erode the real value of the debt. Others advocate austerity, where clamping down on what was considered to be excess will allow existing stocks of debt to continue to be serviced without default. But others see that as promoting social instability and the need to restructure, to write down the debt, what biblically they called the Jubilee. That is the third dimension. That's the most difficult to accomplish in a political sense, and that's why sovereign debt restructuring mechanisms have never been put in place, and why at a conference like this we have to address that challenge.
A little over a decade ago, when the IMF proposed the SDRM, on behalf of Canada, I was a very active proponent, and I remain a strong supporter today. And this is simply because as the world struggles to come to grips with the increasing interdependence of nations, which you all know so well, the hope is that given the benefits of global economic integration, that the globalization will live up to its advanced billing. This, of course, is offset by the fear that globalization's contagion will do us all in. And in my opinion, the key to achieving that hope, to avoiding that fear, is to strengthen and, if necessary, create the multilateral institutions that will make globalization work for everyone. And it's in that context that I believe the SDRM is an idea whose time has come. A decade ago, when we went through this, when the IMF first proposed the SDRM, this was the most frequent argument I heard against the concept. However, in my opinion, moral hazard is actually an argument in favor of a global Chapter 11. Because in fact of life, there is nothing to prevent a sovereign that wants to walk out on its debts from walking out on its debts. Cote d'Ivoire did it a couple of weeks ago. Argentina and Russia are only two of the G20 nations to do it recently. As Rogoff and Reinhardt point out in their book, This Time is Different. The history of sovereign borrowing is in fact the history of sovereign debt restructuring. And thus, in my opinion, moral hazard, the SDRM would not increase the threat, would not increase moral hazard, in my opinion. In fact, it would reduce the greater hazard, that of unilateral default. And it would do so by providing an independent mediator or arbiter whose imprimatur would be a conditioned precedent to the orderly restructuring which would be in everybody's benefit. In that context, of course, the question then is, who will be the arbiter? And that's critical. And my suggestion would be the IMF, provided we were able to handle the issue and provided perhaps ring-fence the issue of its preferred creditor status. As a global economy, I believe that we have been warned by Europe's thrashing about. As a world, we do not seek to build a fiscal union along the lines that Europe seeks today. But the global economy is now so interdependent, and the threat of contagion is now so great that the failure to recognize the needs for the kinds of institutions that will improve the functioning of globalization, the failure to do that is irresponsible.
They should have gone to the IMF 2 years ago. I think the European leaders made some serious mistakes when the crisis formed. They said it was unthinkable to go to the IMF initially. They said restructuring was unthinkable. And I think the mistakes came in part from thinking that the lessons that have been shown over and over and over again, and the way of dealing with sovereign debt crises, from the international debt crisis of the 1980s to Mexican peso crisis of '94 in East Asia, they thought none of this applies to us. We are a privileged club. We don't have any developing countries here, and the problems of developing countries don't have lessons for us. And I think that kind of conviction is probably what steered them wrong.
The euro is still it's still struggling through its debt crisis. The Greek crisis may be temporarily on hold, but I think that continued forced austerity in that country and a political backlash may end, as Jeff said, in a real disorderly default in the not too distant future, and a possible exit from the euro. I think Portugal may also follow that route.
So, you know, I do think that increased exchange rate flexibility is part of the answer, and it's what allowed many of the East Asian countries to recover after a year or so, and while Greece, you know, and the other European countries famously can't do that. But on the other hand, there are advantages to currency unions and fixed exchange rates. They do have advantages, and I think I'm not one of those who thinks that the mistake goes all the way back to forming the euro. I think the euro could have been made to work, but it requires some of these other adjustments and reforms.
I think there's no question, as you look at the information, deciding what is a country whose sovereign debt situation is vulnerable is not an easy thing to put together. And I think, as we've heard today, simple debt to GDP ratios certainly aren't sufficient. I mean, I think they certainly cause you to worry and look, and also looking at primary deficits and so on. But the thing that I really find interesting coming out of this discussion is the importance of institutions. I think as you look at all of the problems that have arisen, it is a lack of credible institutions, and credible, I guess, our presenters have made that case over and over again, which makes it not all that easy to say, all right, now we're going to put in place credible institutions. Obviously, they aren't credible from day one.
In terms of the lessons, I would agree that you have to deal with the problems in a timely fashion. The sooner, the later, the better. That you have to really single out which are the problems, which tend to be complex, and a combination of those. In this case, I mentioned competitiveness as an important issue. But I want to also refer to the issue of burden sharing. And this also goes to politics. Once you realize that you have to take losses, you will have to rewrite some contracts, make sure that the contracts in the future adjust to what can be done are credible, but you have to distribute the adjustment of those contracts, written or not, amongst a variety of stakeholders. And there is very often a problem of fairness amongst those stakeholders that comes up, in the sense that some feel that they take too much of a burden sharing and the others got some sort of a free ride. And this is, again, a political issue that has to be addressed. and has to be legitimized.
So if you have this problem, what do you do? And that gets to the core of what I want to say today. One of the things that you could do is adopt a fiscal rule. And strangely, many developing or emerging market economies over the last decade or so have been moving in this direction. Chile may have been one of the earlier countries to do this in 2001, but today, for instance, in Latin America, Colombia has a fiscal rule very much along the lines of Chile. A bunch of other countries which you wouldn't even call emerging, like Kazakhstan and Mongolia, have been doing the same thing. What do these countries have in common? They're commodity rich and therefore very much prone to the pro-cyclicality problem. Aware of this, they've been adopting fiscal rules. And the IMF has a nice definition of a fiscal rule, which I will not read out, but basically, you know, if you have a target and the target is based on some objective criteria and you have some procedures for hitting that target, you have a rule. And if you believe the IMF, by 2009, there are 80 countries that had something that you would call a rule. But of course, not all rules are created equal. There are all kinds of rules. And according to the fund, only 8 of those had cyclical or structural adjustment built into them, which is, in my view, and I'll talk about this a lot more, the kind of rule you really want. One example in Europe is Sweden. Ireland is working on this today. But of course, one interpretation of the European Fiscal Compact, and I have to plead ignorance here because I've asked a number of European friends and they all give me different interpretations. I'm not sure what's right. But according to some people, in fact, all of Europe ought to be moving to a cyclically adjusted fiscal rule. Whether that will happen or not, of course, I have no idea. Well, something is credible if, among other things, it is politically feasible. And if you try to apply a rule which is more likely to be politically feasible because it allows you for small deficits and recessions and small surpluses and booms, that alone has more credibility. Or to apply that notion to Spain, if Spain were applying a highly counter-cyclical, highly cyclically adjusted rule today, that rule would probably spit out some number which is congruent with some degree of Keynesian stabilization in Spain, which has 21% unemployment. And that alone would make it more credible, because markets would look at the political economy of Spain and say, Spain has 21% unemployment, there are 5 million Spaniards who don't have a job. Well, what is the government going to do? Well, it's going to run a small deficit to stimulate the economy. So these rules, in fact, help you with credibility.
I don't think this is too hard a point to make. I mean, the first session this morning talked a lot about just simply pointing out the scale of the problem, that it is now morphed into a problem for the major countries. And you've got countries that we had traditionally not thought of as being in the category of potentially needing support, all of a sudden being on people's lists. And so when you think about just the scale of the issue from that perspective, I think it's pretty easy to make the argument that if the fund is going to be relevant from the perspective of being a lender, which I would argue under almost any scenario you want them to have that option, you need more resources. Now, the G20 is dealing with that issue as we speak. And to my mind, the relevant question is not that, but what else do you need to have along with that to have that make sense? As you think about expanding the resources for the fund, if you don't simultaneously deal with a governance problem, I think you've got a sort of inherent problem. I think the other thing you need, frankly, to make those resources be used effectively is to have policy alternatives. I think, one of the things that is most striking to me in terms of how the crisis in 08 and 09 was dealt with was having degrees of freedom in policy was absolutely essential. If you didn't have those, every way in which you were constrained in that way limited your choices, and a lot of the downsides to it that we are all might recognize come from the fact that there were tools that you didn't have. One of the obvious ones is SDRM.
We have a tendency to talk about SDRM and was it good or was it bad. I'd like to emphasize, I think there's at least an SDR1 and an SDRM2. The original SDRM got pushback from a lot of sources about the independence, the appropriateness of the role of the IMF and so forth. And many of those issues were addressed in the revision of the proposal on SDRM. Unfortunately, I think by that time, It was pretty clear the U.S. was not going to support it, and so interest waned in the discussions, and I think there's a lot in the revised SDRM proposal that perhaps some people are not conversant with. So I hope that will come out in further discussions. It's true that if you have to cut spending or increase taxes to try to fill the gap, you're going to hurt growth and probably get into a vicious circle as we're seeing in some of the countries involved here. I would just put in one other dimension to it, and that is there is a limit to societal tolerance for the kind of adjustment that can be forced upon a public by the sovereign. And that is something that perhaps we're seeing unfold in Greece more dramatically than in any of the other countries at the present time, and that needs to be taken into account.
There's ongoing discussion after the IMF resources have been tripled at the London G20 summit in April 2009. There is now this ongoing discussion, and they have additional $600 billion. I think this is the figure that which Madame Lagarde mentioned recently, in particular to help Europe. I think this is the idea. So what is the optimal size of the IMF? Louis Alexander made this point that we have to take into account the size of financial intermediation, which is different from the situation 10, 20, 30 years ago.
There are a lot of arguments people have for why we ought to shrink the size of the financial sector. Whether or not you think those arguments are right, I question our ability to do it. Because frankly, the ability to innovate around our whatever controls we put in place. And I'm just not sure it's very useful to think about that as a strategy. That if you have debt that is too high, you create incentive problems. If somebody's debt is so high that every cent they ever make is just going to be turned over to their creditors, then obviously they have no incentive to work. And so we have well-established policies for circumstances under which we write debt down that are not necessarily ones that are done under the objective of what will maximize return to creditors, but rather we make a judgment about how we want to support the supply of credit to individuals by providing enforcement versus dealing with these ex post incentive problems you come when debt is too high. That is a different judgment.
Now, the restructuring of the Greek debt, it has been said this morning that a taboo has been broken, a taboo that after the Second World War, no advanced economy went through a debt restructuring procedure. I have to say, I turn it different. I put it differently, and I would say that Greece is not an advanced economy. Greece is neither an advanced economy nor, I have to say, an emerging market economy. It has features, it has characteristics of a developing country. But this does not help. So where do we stand today? The euro area, and at this point I particularly agree with Mario Draghi in the statement he made in Davos 4 weeks ago, arguing that the euro area today is different from the euro area 4 or 5 months ago. And he's absolutely right. We had changes in government, partly based on elections. In the Italian case, we had a change in government with the government technocrats now. By the way, I'm still of the view that the intervention by the ECB in the Italian government bond market has just prolonged the agony of the previous government. And this issue of a new government could have been brought forward by at least 2 or 3 months. So this was a waste of time and a waste of money.
With the 3 years LTRO and the stance of the ECB in December, away from the notion that the ECB could be the lender of last resort for sovereigns. One way of interpreting the decisions at the end of last year is to say the ECB is taking responsibility, taking charge of banks. The states have to take charge of themselves, and that's the purpose of this fiscal compact. So less of this potential for intervention, although it's not excluded by the text. Now, on PSI, we've moved from one clear approach was saying, let's do a debt sustainability analysis. If
the result is positive, there will be some form of suasion for the private sector to maintain exposure. And if it's negative, then there should be private sector involvement through restructuring, to a very general sentence saying that has to be done in exceptional cases in accordance with IMF practice.
And at the two opposite ends of the spectrum, you have weak banks bringing the sovereign down, which is Ireland. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have weak sovereigns bringing down the banks, which is Greece. And in between, you have shades of gray. But no matter which one the initial shock has hit, over the past 2.5 years, we've had a downward spiral in operation. A shock to the sovereign spreads of Italy results in impairment and losses and loss of confidence in the banking system, which then goes back to the balance sheet of the Italian sovereign, and so on and so forth. A few other lessons are, everybody waited too long, and that was partly because the conditionality threshold to access support in the euro area was so long that Greece waited too long, Portugal waited too long, Ireland waited too long. And all of this fed additional uncertainty and additional contagion. And what you did see in the end was the governments actually paid a price. Governments changed because of that. So they were right in trying to put off the decision so long. And this has serious implications for what level of conditionality we can impose if we are going to mitigate crisis.
Which is to say that I think the euro can only survive if there is a fiscal union involving both budgetary responsibility and mutual acceptance of some degree of collective responsibility for debt. But because the imperative of euro survival is now so strong, that may well happen faster than many people expect. In my experience in America and Britain in particular, it's considered virtually impossible that Europe will eventually evolve into a fully fledged fiscal federation, the United States of Europe. But one of the things that I've learned since the Lehman crisis particularly is that things can move from impossible to inevitable without even passing through improbable.
Now, the question is, what do we mean when we say external debt? There's one simple answer, and it was argued very forcefully this was the correct answer by some. Foreign debt means payable in foreign currency. The reason behind this is very easy to understand. A sovereign debt cannot print its own currency, can print its own currency, can borrow from its central bank, but cannot print foreign currency or borrow from foreign central bank, or it's rather difficult. So it was an argument in favor of that. Two problems. First one, and we see it now, there are monetary areas. In the monetary area, a sovereign debtor cannot print its own currency. And that was even before the euro area was established. You have currency areas in Africa, in the Caribbean, and Senegal, for example, cannot print money which is printed by a central bank. It's an international central bank, the BCO. Same thing now with the euro, and Greece cannot print euros, at least not legally.
Yesterday we had some people saying, no, only if you have a liquidity problem. And I think Sean argued yesterday that no, even when you have a solvency problem, is that when you have to provide the mechanism. And then you have the question of how do we distinguish when a country has only a liquidity problem and a solvency problem. And I think this is a problem which is unsolvable. Unsolvable. For example, in the case of Argentina in 2001, Argentina had a 1% primary surplus. We needed a 3% primary surplus to make our debt sustainable. And people say, it's clear you're not sustainable because there's no bloody way you're going to get 3% of primary surplus. Argentina has never had it in 60 years. So why are you going to convince me? Well, 3 years later, Argentina had a 6% primary surplus. So the question is, how do you actually go about it? And there's always a margin. And this idea that there's a level of taxations on which you can't actually improve, I don't think that's really there. But I think it's a discussion that is very difficult in each specific case to actually solve.
We have had so many conferences over the years with regards to this topic. And generally in our conferences, we conclude some structure might help reduce global risks of sovereign debt crises. But for some reason, we never achieve that. for some reason, we always revert back to a case-by-case approach. And I don't believe at all that a case-by-case approach in any way helps reduce risk of a global crisis. In fact, I suspect that with this entwining as we do this in globalization, the risk has increased while the case-by-case approach has done nothing to stem that. So I think we've come to a point where we really should do something. You know, we really should try and take this collective wisdom of this group and others and this remarkable talent and put it to work to put something in place that can reduce global risk. But we have to recognize that every sovereign debt crisis is unique. There's no cookie-cutter solution. It affects the banks, and in a meaningful way, it affects the real economy that must be addressed. It affects spillover. So we can't assume that if we put a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism or something in plan, we now solve the problem. However, problems get solved so much more easily if there is a structure that's predictable, that's fair, and that is balanced. We have learned that over the years in the corporate community.
Our deliberations have not only been timely in terms of some of the very immediate issues that we've been discussing and debating, but it seems to me they will clearly remain important challenges going forward. Now, the theme of the conference has been are institutions up to the challenge? And I think the answer is clearly no. I think that has come through all of our deliberations.
On the negative side, I would see first, as I mentioned, very little debate about the role of central banks in inducing asset bubbles. Second, all these distortions, tax distortion, mortgage subsidies have remained in force. To my knowledge, not much has happened to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which is an example of politicized credit allocation.
In principle, there were very good conditions for this experiment to take place in Europe because of the good relationship in general between the Europeans and the IMF, because the Europeans had already institutions, they had a legal system, they had the expertise, so they had the counterpart, the natural counterpart to the IMF existed, and nevertheless, I'm not sure we can be very convinced by the way it has gone. I'm very happy the IMF intervened in Europe. I think the Europeans didn't have the expertise at the time about what is a program. Simply, the way of reasoning was, if you've got a budget deficit, you have to reduce a budget deficit, but by definition, it's going to be financed. The notion that a budget deficit may not be financed was something that the Europeans had no experience of. So they really needed the IMF involvement for the programs.
At least as important is to create a structure that has other components that are essential for making restructuring happen in a timely manner. First of all, one point made this morning is the gathering information and dispersing it to make the process fairer is very important. Perhaps also as importantly is a point made by several people this morning that cutting down on the very costly delay in reaching decisions about whether a severely indebted creditor needs to restructure is very important. In a sense, it's important to remove a political bias in the current institutional setup that pushes us toward costly and at times counterproductive financing of severely indebted sovereign borrowers.
So the point I'm trying to make is that the system is basically designed usually to protect itself. And then if you compare what's happening in Greece to what happened, let's say, to the Latin American countries in the banking crisis of 1982, which was in many ways very similar, the system always protected itself. and wanted to preserve itself. And that's what happened in Latin America, and you had then the lost decade for Latin America, and that's what's happening in Greece. So the question of sovereign debt reorganization and so on needs to be considered in a larger context of the system that is preserving itself.
First of all, this debate has fallen off the table. So I think any effort that can be made to at least put it out there so that for one of those strange reasons that comes up in the international economy, someone decides it's in their interest to pick this up and run with it. It's there, and it's not, oh, boy, that was 10 years ago that we thought about that the last time. So I think opening the debate is one really good thing. The second thing is, I like the idea of framing this whole thing around principles, because I do think there are some principles that people would probably be able to move ahead with, probably within the IMF, probably be able to move ahead with, that would at least get closer to a better solution and pave the way for something more if that ever comes up. But as I said, I think that the way this really would stand the best hope is to have a little spate of pretty severe fiscal problems, whether they're in Europe or even outside Europe, at some time in the next 5 to 10 years. And I think this is not
a gain in the future.
I think this conference on sovereign debt is very, very important. Recognizing how sovereign debt has been, what you might call, subsidized by all the system architecture, the so-called Bank for International Settlements, BIS Basel standards 1, 2, and 3, have encouraged financial institutions to load up on sovereign debt. They pay a very low capital charge, if any at all. As a result, what is a sovereign crisis with the so-called riskless asset has now been unmasked as a very risky proposition and propagated and become a banking crisis. So you have a banking crisis at the same time as you have a fiscal crisis, particularly in Europe right now. And how we unravel those things, how we address those things, how you divide the burden, who bears the burden of the adjustment, of the restructuring, is very important. Some people advocate inflation to erode the real value of the debt. Others advocate austerity, where clamping down on what was considered to be excess will allow existing
We've just come out of our first joint CIGI INET conference here in Canada. The CIGI INET partnership, which we entered into a little over a year ago, is a new partnership which brings together, I think, two very exciting organizations. INET, which is rethinking economics, and of course CIGI, which is rethinking governance, and how we can tackle common problems together. And we bring complementary skills, perspectives, people to these issues. This conference happened to focus on sovereign debt restructuring issues, which have come to the forefront again in today's economy because of what's been happening in Europe and in Greece in particular. But this is a reoccurring problem which we seem to go through every decade. And so there was a real sense that we could bring people together to bring some fresh perspectives and hopefully find a better way to address some of these questions which inevitably will arise.
To avoiding that fear is to strengthen and, if necessary, create the multilateral institutions that will make globalization work for everyone. And it's in that context that I believe the SDRM is an idea whose time has come. A decade ago, when we went through this, when the IMF first proposed the SDRM, this was the most frequent argument I heard against the concept. However, in my opinion, moral hazard is actually an argument in favor of a global Chapter 11. Because in fact of life, there is nothing to prevent a sovereign that wants to walk out on its debts from walking out on its debts. Cote d'Ivoire did it a couple of weeks ago. Argentina and Russia are only two of the G20 nations to do it recently. As Rogoff and Reinhardt point out in their book, This Time is Different, the history of sovereign borrowing is in fact the history of sovereign debt restructuring. And thus, in my opinion, moral hazard, the SCRM would not increase the threat, would not increase moral hazard, in my opinion. In fact, it would reduce the greater hazard, that of unilateral default. And it would do so by providing an independent mediator or arbiter whose imprimatur would be a conditioned precedent to the orderly restructuring which would be in everybody's benefit. In that context, of course, the question then is, who will be the arbiter? And that's critical. And my suggestion would be the IMF, provided we were able to handle the issue, and provided maybe perhaps ring-fence the issue of its preferred creditor status. As a global economy, I believe that we have been warned by Europe's thrashing about. As a world, we do not seek to build a fiscal union along the lines that Europe seeks today. But the global economy is now so interdependent, and the threat of contagion is now so great, that the failure to recognize the needs for the kinds of institutions that will improve the functioning of globalization, the failure to do that is irresponsible.
Stocks of debt to continue to be serviced without default. But others see that as promoting social instability and the need to restructure, to write down the debt, what biblically they call the Jubilee. That is the third dimension. That's the most difficult to accomplish in a political sense, and that's why sovereign debt restructuring mechanisms have never been put in place, and why at a conference like this we have to address that challenge.
A little over a decade ago, when the IMF proposed the SDRM, on behalf of Canada, I was a very active proponent, and I remain a strong supporter today. And this is simply because as the world struggles to come to grips with the increasing interdependence of nations, which you all know so well, the hope is that given the benefits of global economic integration, that the globalization will live up to its advanced billing. This, of course, is offset by the fear that globalization's contagion will do us all in. And in my opinion, the key to achieving that hope